Recently, I uploaded a video talking about some of the rarest Pokemon in each main series Pokemon game that was the first game in their generation. We started with Pokemon Red and Blue and ended with Pokemon Sun and Moon, but some of these games, such as the remake games and the other versions if you will, were excluded in that video, mainly due to time. Today, we will take a look at some of the rarest Pokemon in each remake Pokemon game, and for this video, we'll also include Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee, since they fit closer to a remake game rather than any other type of game in the series, as they weren't the first game in their region, and they aren't a third version of any game. Just like in the last video, however, a Pokemon will be considered rare based on its encounter rate as well as the overall areas it's available within this given game. Event-only Pokemon such as Serebii will be excluded since they don't exactly have an encounter rate, and the only real legitimate way to get one is through a random Wi-Fi event or some other event throughout the game, as well as any static legendary Pokemon since you're guaranteed to encounter at least one in their specific games, which doesn't exactly make them too rare in my opinion. Pokemon like this can technically be considered rare by some users, I guess, but for the context of this video, let's just stick to encounter rate instead. Going by encounter rate and just overall areas can make things a little bit tricky as it's not an exact science. Somebody actually left a comment at one of my previous videos. Let me know an actual formula that I could use in order to find the Pokemon for each game. So maybe in a future video we can take a look at that formula. Basically the way it works was it would take into account the overall different locations in that given Pokemon game, and you would also take into account the encounter rate of the Pokemon on top of the overall areas in the game to come up with an actual percentage onto how often you would encounter that Pokemon versus every other Pokemon, every other area in the game. We'll start off with the very first remake game in the series, and that's Pokemon FireRed and Pokemon LeafGreen. Since we're looking at remake games, a lot of the encounter rates will be similar to the games that they are based on, but there are still a lot of differences when it comes to catchable Pokemon in Pokemon remakes, as there are new Pokemon added from the previous remakes, such as new generations, and maybe even some new areas. Just like in their parent games Red and Blue, Kangaskhan is also very rare in Pokemon FireRed and LeafGreen. It is only catchable in the Safari Zone, of course, with only a 1% encounter rate in one area of the Safari Zone and a 4% encounter rate in another area of the Safari Zone. This is very similar to Pokemon Red and Blue, as Kangaskhan was only available in 2 parts of the Safari Zone as well in those games with these same encounter rates. It's also interesting to see that in Pokemon Yellow version, Kangaskhan's encounter rate was buffed significantly to 15%, which is kind of strange. 15% is actually one of the highest encounter rates Kangaskhan has in any main series Pokemon game. FireRed and LeafGreen also added the Serebii Islands to the mix on top of the base Red and Blue games just having the Kanto region, which added a lot more areas to explore and of course a lot more different Pokemon to catch in these areas. There's one area in the Serebii Islands called the Serebii Chambers where the only capturable Pokemon is unknown. You can encounter every single unknown variant in this area, however they don't all have the same encounter rates for each different unknown form. This place is broken up to various smaller chambers, each housing different unknown forms. In the Monian chamber, you have a whopping 99% chance to encounter an unknown A, and only a 1% chance to encounter the unknown question mark. Unknown exclamation mark also has only a 1% encounter rate in another part of the cave, and so does unknown O, strangely enough. Now, technically, these are all the same Pokemon, but I do find it interesting how some forms are much more common than others, and some are very rare, even a 1% encounter rate. No matter which one of these unknowns you catch, however, it will still complete the same Pokedex entry, but if you truly want to catch every single unknown form in FireRed and LeafGreen, then expect to spend a lot of time in some of these chambers and encountering a lot of unknown A's. Now to continue on with the next Pokemon remake game, we have Pokemon HeartGold and SoulSilver, the Gold and Silver remakes of course. Much like FireRed and LeafGreen, the HeartGold and SoulSilver games change the encounter rates a little bit of some Pokemon based off of Gold and Silver, has a few extra routes, and of course includes some of the newer Pokemon that were introduced since Gold and Silver initially released nearly 20 years ago. Now, much like the games they are based on, HeartGold and SoulSilver also features random Pokemon outbreaks. Now, an outbreak is when a certain Pokemon has an increased encounter rate for a short amount of time in a specific area, and it's at random. With this in mind, we have Yanma with only a 1% encounter rate on Route 35, however it can be an outbreak Pokemon, which would ramp its encounter rate up to 40% during this outbreak period. Swarms or outbreaks do complicate things a little bit, as we do also have a Pokemon like Clamperl, which can only appear through a storm and has a 60% encounter rate. 60% for an encounter rate is actually rather high, and it's actually pretty good. However, since this Pokemon is only available through outbreaks, it makes it a lot more difficult to catch than the typical 60% encounter rate Pokemon. We also have Snubbull, which much like Yanma is only available on one route with a 1% encounter rate, and has a chance to be an outbreak Pokemon, boosting its encounter rate to 40% as well. I thought Snubbull was a rather interesting Pokemon to be this rare, as Snubbull is definitely one of the more popular Generation 2 Pokemon, as it was one of the first Gen 2 Pokemon ever revealed way back in the day. Now as for the rest of HeartGold and SoulSilver, I can't find any other 1% encounter rate Pokemon. Also, I can't find any 1% encounter rate Pokemon that aren't available in multiple routes and aren't in swarms. The next closest rare Pokemon I can find for HeartGold and SoulSilver is Skarmory with a 5% encounter rate. Now much like in Gold and Silver, Skarmory is a version exclusive to one of the games, as Skarmory is only available in SoulSilver and is located on Route 45. This is an optional route in the game, making it pretty easy to miss as well. Now moving on, we have Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, the remake games of Ruby and Sapphire, of course. We don't exactly have many new areas to explore compared to the base Ruby and Sapphire games, especially compared to the other two previous games we talked about. We do, however, have what is called the Battle Resort in Rarest, a small island for Pokemon which you can actually fish for. One of these Pokemon that you can fish for is Mantine, which only has a 1% encounter rate in this one area of the game. You have a much better chance of catching its pre-evolution Mantike, however, which has a 30% encounter rate, meaning it's a lot easier to catch a Mantike, level it up, and then boom, you have a Mantine if you really want a Mantine for whatever reason. Next up we have Chimecho, just like its original games it's based off of Ruby and Sapphire. Chimecho in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire is only available at the top of Mount Pyre once again, however this time its encounter was increased to 5% from the 2% in Ruby and Sapphire. This might not sound like much of an increase, but 5% is actually a pretty significant change from 2%, as 2% is much harder to find. The problem with this though is that Chimecho is still only available in a very specific part of a very specific area, making it tricky to find as you're not very likely to go to this area very often. It's pretty easy to miss, and odds are you're not going to catch Chimecho unless you already know it's there and you're going out of your way to find one. This next Pokemon is the first one that has a significantly lower encounter rate in one version versus the other, despite being available in both games, from what I've seen so far at least, and that's Illumise. Illumise is only available on Route 117 in Rarest, with a good encounter rate of 20% in Omega Ruby. In Alpha Sapphire, however, this encounter rate is only 4%, even lower than Chimecho. This also goes for Illumise's counterpart Pokemon Volbeat, being more common in Alpha Sapphire with the 20% encounter rate, and only having a 4% encounter rate in Omega Ruby. And that's pretty much all I can find for Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. I didn't really notice anything lower than a 4% encounter rate, unlike other older games we've talked about, which have multiple 1% encounter rate Pokemon. It seems like they made Pokemon easier to encounter with a lot of these newer Pokemon games, so players don't have to spend as much time tracking down specific Pokemon that they want to have for their team. And finally, we have Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Pokemon Let's Go Eevee. These games are quite different from most main series Pokemon games, probably the most different to be honest, as despite Game Freak labeling these Let's Go games as main series Pokemon games, they have some big differences from the other main series games we've had in the past. One of the biggest differences in these games is how you actually encounter Pokemon, as instead of walking into a patch of grass and randomly finding a random wild Pokemon that you have really no control over, in Let's Go, you can actually see the Pokemon wandering around the overworld before you have a chance to run into them and spark the encounter. Now, despite all of this, one of the hardest Pokemon to encounter in Let's Go is actually Dragonair. Dragonair only has a 1% encounter rate in these Let's Go games, and is only located when you're surfing in the water of Route 10. Dragonair actually has a lower encounter rate than its evolution Dragonite in these games for whatever reason, and it's also available in far less areas than its evolution Dragonite. We also have this really weird case when it comes to Melton in Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, which technically isn't even obtainable in these games on its own, as in order to get one in Let's Go, you do have to connect it up with your phone in Pokemon Go and complete certain tasks in Pokemon Go to obtain this Melton, which you can then transfer over to Let's Go. I can see how people can consider this one to be one of the rarest Pokemon in Let's Go, but since it isn't exactly obtainable in the Let's Go games on its own without any outside source, it doesn't exactly count. And those are some of the rarest Pokemon in each main series remake Pokemon game, as well as Let's Go, since it fits best for this video versus any other type of game. Let me know in the comment section down below if there's any other Pokemon that I missed in this video that are really rare, specifically any Pokemon with encounter rate of 2% or less and is only available in one singular area of the game, and preferably a more obscure area. And with all of that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you guys leave a like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel a ton, and make sure you ring that post notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads of mine in the future. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. I will see you all next time, and bye bye.